Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our healthcare roundtable. And thank you for attending this roundtable. My name is Michaela Felstein. I'm a tech and data analyst at Natixis, and I'm going to moderate this healthcare roundtable together with Isabelle, who's right next to me, who's the chairperson of Evanston's Board of Management, and Antoine Ganancia from Clipperton.
And we have people from French, Belgium, Luxembourg, or rather is in charge, of Luxembourg, French-speaking African countries. We've got Odile Allaire, who is CEO and founder of Fitix. Alain Puquet, you work at the Institut Mérieux, and Mr. Cédric Moreau, you are a partner at Sophie Nova. So that's it. I think we've introduced everyone now. Before we go into detail, I would just like to take a step back and look at healthcare and look at the challenges that we face in healthcare. So most developed countries have to deal with an aging population, with a share of people over 65 that is increasing and will continue increasing in the next decades. As you can see on the slide here, with the Eurostat forecasts, with the share of people over 80 increasing as well. Aging population means that people are more at risk of having neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson. And for all age categories, there is an increase in chronic diseases, so diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure. For example, the number of people suffering from diabetes has increased twofold between 2010 and 2019, and that has a huge impact on a patient's life. It needs a special and continuous care. So on top of this higher demand for care, there is also an increase in health expenditure that makes up a greater part of GDP. There you've got the stats for the EU, 8.3% of GDP for health expenditure on average across the EU. So chronic diseases, sorry, I'm a bit lost in my notes. I say greater demand for healthcare, more health expenditure, and in healthcare, as we realized during the pandemic, there are not enough beds in hospitals and not enough healthcare professionals. So it is important to control these healthcare costs whilst making sure that the care offering is still fit for purpose and good enough. And this is where technology comes into play, because it will allow us to be more efficient and to have quality healthcare. The pandemic, in fact, showed us that technology was very useful to access healthcare. For example, having an appointment with your GP online, and you could also book an appointment for a jab, for instance, on an app. And technology will shape medicine in the future. It will be more focused on prevention rather than on treatments. It will be more individualized, tailor-made, and the patient will be really much more proactive. So during this roundtable, we're going to talk about technological innovation, how it comes about. Generally, it's born out of collaboration between different players. We're going to look at the future of healthcare and how innovation is going to change things in the future. So now, let's kick off with a first question to all of our panelists. Often we hear that the pandemic has sped up innovation in healthcare. If it is the case, which areas enjoyed this speeding up or benefited from it? And in fact, is that even true? Is there not a more nuanced answer to that? Shall we let the ladies amongst the panelists start off, maybe? Yes, I listened to what was happening in the other roundtable. I think that the pandemic really sped up change, generally speaking. I think that's something that's important to bear in mind. And often we say that to innovate from a technological point of view, you also need to change the way in which you organize yourself. So if you've got good technical solutions, but you don't know how to deploy them, if you don't know how to organize things around these changes, then it doesn't work. So what we've seen in our teams, but also amongst healthcare professionals, is that the pandemic really sped things up from a digital perspective. We live in a world now where doctors, our team, we all work in a very traditional way. It was very difficult to do tele-maintenance, to do anything digital, really. In fact, our teams traveled a lot. And now we realize that we can do maintenance on machines remotely, we can work from home, and we can do also a lot of meetings online. And another takeaway also has to do with collaboration. In France, collaboration, partnerships between the private and the public sector is often complicated. It's quite taboo. In fact, I've worked a lot on that kind of collaboration, and all of a sudden during the pandemic, it was obvious that we had to collaborate with one another. For instance, we were able in a fortnight to make a scanner available in a kind of box outside, so that we could treat COVID patients that needed it the most. And that would have been completely unthinkable before the pandemic. Odile Allard, over to you. Well, we didn't have any solutions at the beginning when it comes to treating people with COVID, and I agree with what has just been said. It's our whole internal organization that was shaken up, because we organize the schedules for surgeons, and we're only a small company, but for us it was vital to keep this connection with our clients, vital to find new prospects as well. So we had e-master classes that we put online with our opinion leaders who were no longer operating because they were not involved in COVID, but they had filmed themselves on the job, and it allowed us to generate more prospects without taking part in huge conferences. So there again, it was about collaboration that was born out of the pandemic. This microphone going around is not very COVID safe, really. Yeah, we made the same comment earlier. We'll let the organizers know. Well, I think that people have noticed that, or some people might think that there has been more innovation apart from the vaccines, and in fact, even the vaccines really came out from research that was carried out in 2005. So there was not any huge piece of innovation. And all the companies that came out on top, they used technology that was already out there. Now, some companies were innovative in the way they use the technology, but the technology is quite old, in fact. Now, Cédric will talk about the perception of the public at large, but it's true that telemedicine has sped up incredibly. That's going to open the field up for many different businesses. But over and beyond that, don't forget that up until very recently, only a biologist doctor could give you your test results. But now this has changed. You can do any kind of test, a blood test in a retirement home, in a chemist shop, and anybody can give you the results. So it opens up the field for home testing and self-testing. And thirdly, for the future, the pandemic has also shaken up the regulatory authority that was sort of lagging behind and waiting for change. So it has changed things quite a lot, for example, for reimbursement in France and Germany, and to a lesser extent in the United States. So that also will change things in the future. Cédric Moreau, over to you. Well, from an investor's perspective, the speeding up aspect for me was really the fact that people realized that healthcare was innovative, that it had a huge impact. I mean, we knew it, but the public realized it during the pandemic. And it's true that you need to be in good health. I mean, we wish each other good health and a happy new year, but it's really something that is important. And the perception of the healthcare sector is much kinder now in a way than it used to be in the past. And that means more capital flowing into healthcare, more private investors who want to expose themselves or overexpose themselves into healthcare, and also a lot of public funding that flowed into healthcare on the long term. So that is extremely positive. Now, has it really changed our life on a daily basis? Not really. There's some innovation cycles that are really long-term cycles. The risk-benefit ratio are pretty much the same to what they were before the crisis. And we also had to take on some challenges. We're talking here about speeding things up, but one of the huge challenges that I had to deal with was the fact that clinical trials were stopped because the hospitals were no longer able to deal with clinical trials. And biotech companies can only create value and be innovative if they can run clinical trials. So overall, yeah, it was interesting to be front and center and to get more investors come on board. But as an investor, for me, it has not changed my perception when it comes to the risk-benefit ratio. Well, thank you very much for this first round. We're now going to move on to the next question. After a year and a half of meeting up on Teams, I realized that men and women are not on an equal footing at work. It's true that if you're wearing a skirt on one of these high stools, it's much less comfortable than if you're wearing trousers. So a question for Odile now on cooperation between small and medium-sized companies with external partners, because for cutting-edge technology, it's important to collaborate with doctors, physicians, specialists, experts, but also entrepreneurs and R&D experts. So how can you pursue this collaboration with external players? Well, for collaboration, really it's part of our DNA, because you can't build any kind of technology without collaborating. You need to work with physicians, with doctors, with health centers. I mean, you were absolutely right. When you talked about clinical trials, it was one of the difficult challenges of the pandemic. And we also talked a lot about healthcare professionals during the pandemic, but our teams were out there also and working relentlessly. And that's also an important aspect of collaboration. Regarding collaboration, I'd like to share two examples. Earlier, I talked about technological and organizational change. Earlier, I told you about this scanner, this machine that we made available outside the hospital in a big box to treat the people who had COVID and absolutely needed that scanner. From an organization point of view, we could have increased our capacity. The army is not the only one that can set up emergency rooms and beds. I think that we could have focused a bit more on our organization, on our setup, and maybe we could have taken in more patients than we did at the beginning. So we collaborated, but we could have gone a little further, I think. And there's another example that I'd like to share. It has to do with artificial intelligence. You might have noticed that at the beginning it was difficult to identify what the virus was, so we collaborated with hospitals in Paris, and 20 doctors took 10,000 scans and marked them so that the AI could recognize who were the patients with COVID and who were the patients that didn't have COVID, so that we could treat the people who needed it with the right kind of treatment. So it's a good example of collaboration. I'm sure there are many others, but it really shows that we can go really quickly if we collaborate. And when you collaborate from a technical point of view, you also need to collaborate on how you organize yourself. Well, our story is, of course, a bit different. I created a startup, so we started from scratch, and all of our products are born out of French research and French patents. And starting from there, with our R&D team and with our collaboration with ECA, we were able to put a first product out there. And then we had to prove that this product has got a clinical interest. So for a startup, we didn't focus on France. We deployed on a greater scale. We went international, and we picked opinion leaders in the area that is interesting for us, and we convinced them so that they use the product, and then they can do tests, they can get clinical data, and they can publish research articles. That was for our first product about 10 years ago, and it's the same cycle every single time. It's a virtuous circle. We work with French laboratories and with international clinical teams, and this is the only way it works. Even as a startup, we need to continue to be innovative in the range of products that we offer. Thank you very much. Next question for Cédric. So you're a partner at Sofinova, one of the larger healthcare funds in Europe and the world. You are very well positioned to keep track of innovations in healthcare. What are the main trends that you've seen over the last few years, COVID set aside?
Alors là, c'était très intéressant.
Well, it's really very interesting, the slides that we had earlier with the chronic diseases that are increasing with Alzheimer's, with Parkinson, etc. My perspective is that it's not really an evolution in the kinds of diseases that we see appearing here and there. It's really more about new products. You've probably heard about monoclonal antibodies, and now we are focusing on cell therapy. So we are far removed from what politicians used to tell us on medicine in France. what's going to help us forge ahead in the future is how can we build bioproduction capacity.
Le comité stratégique de filière CSF
The Strategic Committee CFS Estate in November 2020 launched the Alliance Bioproduction France to really take on this challenge. The ambition is for France to be a leader in bioproduction by 2030. I hope it will be the case, but it means that people are starting to put some thought into the matter. And in fact, it means that currently it's the process that is the product. So an investor like ourselves or like others need to take into account complexity, challenge, but also the value that can be created in bioproduction. I mean, I could share with you a whole number of examples, but I think it's important to discuss bioproduction and not just talk about innovation and healthcare, about being an industry that is closed off like a box. No, there's a lot of things upstream. There's a lot of issues that also pertain to strategic independence. And bioproduction, so biological products, make up 40% of products that are approved right now, and it'll be more than 50% pretty soon. So it's important to be positioned in this area and to have your own capacity.
Thank you very much. During the second part of this roundtable, we're going to talk about major innovations in healthcare. First question to all four of you around digital development. Everybody's talking about digital development. The public is really interested in this throughout the healthcare value chain. So how can we make sure that this translates into concrete applications, things that are really useful for the patient in the end? Alain, go ahead.
Donc pour le digital, c'est vrai qu'il y a vraiment un engouement. Il y a eu
it's true that there was a lot said about digitization. So I believe that we are on the down part of the bell-shaped curve. I was reading the High Health Authority's report recently, and they have identified something like 300,000 different applications in healthcare. It's enormous, but of course this does not necessarily give you a big benefit, does not give a big benefit to the patient. So you can sow these digital seeds, but if the earth is not fertile, it doesn't work. So Dominique Pont and Laurent Letourneau have really given a lot of thought to the roadmap to make sure that interoperability and the security be present in France. And so all of these digital applications can move to scale only if the whole environment is organized to do that. Otherwise, we're just going to have a host of small applications without major applications in the medical sense. That's what I feel. Well, I'm trying to look at your question from my environment perspective. What we see is that digital now goes beyond the software of our products in the interconnection of the systems. From the clinical standpoint, we have a lot of automated systems, but we did not have the patient record. And so now we're going to have something where everything, I mean, all of the tests that will be taken by a patient and all of the surgery results, for instance, are going to be centralized in a patient record. So this is where I see digital innovation in the future. I think we have to keep in mind that we talk a lot about hospitals, but health is much more than hospitals alone. Our health system is based on a something that dates back to the Second World War, where we were trying to cure patients, but now we're looking at prevention in an area where we have lots of data. So, for instance, we do diagnosis with our machines, we have PET scans and so on, and we have about 80% of data that's just not used. We have lots of intensive care units where everything is done by hand. When actually, thanks to AI and thanks to digitalization, we would be able to save more lives because we could predict things more. We would be able to treat patients better, differently, because of course there's the infrastructures, that's one thing, but then you also have the human factor. How can you sort patients quicker? How can you all get organized quicker? So within the hospital, of course, digitalization is essential for interconnection purposes between the various teams to the benefit of the patient, but also in our general environment. What is going to be the hospital of the future? Where will the patients be? How will they be cared for? Will there be specialists and so on? And this will actually be based on the data that we're going to get and our ability to exchange data.
Cédric, est-ce que vous voulez prendre la parole sur le
Cédric, do you want to say something on the issue of
je pense qu'on peut déjà faire une constatation, c'est que notre industrie de la santé, son ubérisation est quand même peut-être un peu plus compliquée que dans d'autres secteurs. Parce que c'est un secteur qui est ultra réglementé, probablement le secteur le plus réglementé au monde, et puis qu'évidemment, le gros des payeurs sont des stakeholders, comme on dit, sont des États, des gouvernements, et que
governments, things are very well and strictly regulated, and so of course we also have to manage the medical and economic aspects.
En tant qu'investisseur, nous, ce qu'on regarde, c'est notamment la capacité que le digital et l'intelligence artificielle peuvent avoir pour réduire les taux d'attrition. Je vous parlais tout à l'heure du risque bénéfice. Globalement, un produit qui rentre en clinique, donc on a fait des tests chez les animaux, il rentre en clinique, il n'a que 5% de probabilité de succès d'arriver sur le marché. Ça, c'est aujourd'hui. Alors pourquoi? Parce qu'il faut trouver la bonne biologie, les bonnes cibles, la bonne application thérapeutique, etc. Et donc le digital, l'intelligence artificielle peuvent permettre, et il y a des sociétés qui se spécialisent là-dessus, d'essayer de réduire le taux d'attrition, d'avoir les bons leads, donc de se tromper moins en amont. Donc voilà une application concrète dans une industrie qui est très chère. Si évidemment on baisse
very expensive industry, if you decrease the attrition rate, obviously you're going to improve productivity and reduce the overall costs. Now, as far as clinical trials are concerned, we're talking about patient stratification. In other words, as was said by way of introduction, we are talking about targeted medicine, more personalized, more individualized medicine, and so you are going to have CROs, in other words, companies that are specialized in clinical research that are selecting the right patients based on these solutions. And then finally, when you're on the market, then you're going to have a phase 4 management, pharmacovigilance, and compliance issues to make sure that the product that's now on the market is indeed prescribed in the right way and that it's used by the patient in the right way. So we have digital solutions throughout the value chain, but today it's a bit longer for us in this industry rather than in other industries, and because there are always lots of regulations at various steps. And then there's always the issue of knowing who is going to pay. So the business model is an important point. Well, I was discussing this with a hospital director who was saying, okay, that they had no digital tool really to decide on who was going to get surgery and who wasn't during the COVID crisis, and this was all Excel spreadsheet based. Okay, so we talk about robotics in distribution, in the supply chain, everywhere. Now, in healthcare manufacturing, or in the care actually provided, now is robotics developing as fast as in other areas? What is your opinion on this? So I'm going to wear my two hats, that of my former job and that of my current job. When we talk about robotics, and I like to really also refer to the clinical trials that you were mentioning. We talked a lot about robotics to have the best possible marketing strategy to sell their robots, But, I mean, selling robots is not an end in itself. It has to be of a certain benefit to patients, and we have to have real clinical trials. And this is something that I think disturbed the way we envisage robots. Is that aiming at patients, or is this supposed to help the doctors and the hospital show off? So how can we have smaller incisions? How can we be remotely assisted by high-flown professors who can help you? So yes, there's a point behind robotics, but it goes very, very slowly because it's difficult to actually demonstrate the economic value of robotics. So I think that this is where we have to devote our energy, always keeping the patient in mind. And we're in countries where we think that the doctor, the surgeon is God, you know. But when you talk about robots, it means that you have to share between the value of the act between the surgeon and the robot. So I think we really have to work on this particular aspect and conduct clinical trials so that we're not simply talking about marketing and to get a price-quality ratio, which is a healthy one in the end. And in France, we have lots of good examples of robotics applications, but we need to be able to produce these applications in France and to also be able to disseminate them in France as well. This is very important. I would like to add to this that there's one point which is really important, namely funding of all this. I mean, the very last latest success was obtained by Intuitive Surgical that produced this Da Vinci robot, which was a true revolution in operating on prostate cancer. The $2 million per robot. The first one we've ever had was in the Neuilly Hospital near Paris. So because it's so expensive, you think twice about buying it. So there's a question of cost. I mean, this company had to invest $1 billion before actually having finished the development. So the capital expenditure is huge. So we have to think about trying to release more capital, finding more capital, and more funding for these robots. We're talking about the digital era, and all of these robots are assisted. So there's programming, planning of the actual surgery, of the operations, and here we're talking about GPS systems with more accuracy, with more safety, and I think that digital applications will help us tremendously. And also, the other point is the logistics behind all of this. The robot actually really completely changes the whole operations and surgery arena. So we're going to have to change practices, we're going to have to train people. It's not just like a box of medicine in a pharmacy. So this requires a lot of downstream work, and this means that access to the market is much more complicated. And this also might explain why we have fewer developments there than elsewhere. Laurence, I think that there's another topic we wanted to discuss, namely AI. This is a topic that is widely discussed. You work in the IDEN consortium, which aims at developing AI in medical imaging. Can you tell us a little bit about the origin of this project and what you're doing with it? Well, iDream is a French project. General Electric and Air France have set up a consortium, and this became then a global project. So it's always really interesting, that kind of situation where you have a project that can grow and that can then become global. So the idea behind iDream is to help startup companies accelerate their AI projects. In other words, how can we work together on a specific platform where we can share our data so that the startups that really need those data can actually use it and speed up their project development. This is something that's really important because we are in a startup nation, and I believe my neighbor here can discuss it. But it's wonderful to have startups, but if you cannot grow the startup, if you cannot grow the projects and integrate them into other projects, it's completely pointless, because then you cannot actually disseminate these technical solutions. So with iDream, we have this particular aim of working together. How can we help small companies very quickly place new innovations on the market? So we're talking about access, market access and dissemination of innovations. So Odile, maybe you can tell us what you experience and the difficulties you experience, even though your company is one of the technological leaders in fluorescence-based imaging, but you found it very difficult to access the French market, more specifically the French market, much more so than having access to other markets. Yes, well, this dates back to a few years already, but it's still true today. It's just a small anecdote. I'm not going to mention names, but we are one of the leaders on the thyroid market with our system. And we are one of the, we went to see a French leader on the market, and he said, well, yes, wonderful, please lend me this instrument, it's wonderful. And after a year, after a year, sorry, he said, it's wonderful, I'm going to order it. And it took him actually 3 years before he could order it. It's 80,000 euros, okay? And I really like them, but we had to lend them the machine for 3 years, free of charge, for them to be finally able to buy this product. He was very enthusiastic. He said, "Okay, I can with this equipment, I can demonstrate that there are fewer complications and so on." But it took him 3 years to actually be able to sign the contract and be funded. The difference with the US market, for instance, when an innovator is interested in something like this, well, first of all, the health system is very different because there are many more private hospitals in the US, and there's a lot of competition. So if they have an innovation, they call their customers, they call their clients. We sold another system, and the week that followed the installation of the system, the surgeon was on television with the patient whom he had operated on, testifying to what he had done and how wonderful it was. And for us, it was incredible, because when we try to get surgeons to testify in our hospitals or on television, it's always very, very difficult. Your name can never be mentioned, your product is not mentioned, and your company name is not mentioned. Whereas over there in the US, I mean, our name was mentioned repeatedly, and that's a very big difference between the two markets. So we have to live with it. I'm not talking about reimbursement, because here again, this is going to take a long, long time. But we just asked, because investors are saying, okay, is this reimbursed by the system? But this is not yet something that we have envisaged. And now we're just starting on the path of trying to see whether this machine that demonstrates that we decrease the number of complications or cases with complications can be reimbursed. But we haven't done this yet. And this is the problem with access to the French market. I'm not criticizing, I'm just giving you facts. I mean, we can't criticize, it's just facts, basically.
Je défends la HS.
Merci.
C'est la même question. Enfin,
oui, mais en fait, c'est une bonne transition.
In fact,
donc, on a parlé un peu des obstacles côté start-up.
we discussed the obstacles for startups on the adoption of new technologies. It would be interesting to know what the vision is of a large group like Mérieux on questions of diagnosis, immunotherapies, and so on. What are the obstacles that you meet with? It's the same obstacles. We just have more financing means. I mean, we have more money, more capital. So the first obstacle is regulatory approval, and it takes a long time in France. That is true. And then after that, since health products are reimbursed, the reimbursement rate also has to be determined, and this takes another few years before the decision is made. And it's difficult because obviously the new digital-based products actually are not part of what is usually decided on, and in the US, for instance, they actually prepared the ground with a number of mechanisms for so that the product, the innovative health products can be put on the market quicker, and it's wonderful. In Germany, for instance, there's a new law which is called the Digital Act, which says, when you put a new digital product on the market, a medical product on the market, you'll be reimbursed for 1 year, and then we'll see. And so in France, we have a number of entities that come into play, that each have their own prerogatives. So usually the High Health Authority makes a report, then we have at the end a glossary with all of the acronyms, and there are about 100 different acronyms, just to tell you how many entities are involved. But we have people who are really who are very good people and who have understood all of this, but the system is very slow. And also, this is a system where each individual operations, each individual transaction is reimbursed, and this is very, very difficult. Of course, what we want is to optimize the whole health itinerary of the patient, which means a lot of data, and which means a complete change of paradigm, where we agree that some health products will be reimbursed more, so as to have a better care path for the patient. So this is what we're working on, but it's going to take time.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Next question now. A question about the risk of having two kinds of medicine, or double standards in medicine. We talked about the digital gap a few years ago. Might we have the similar kind of problem between different regions in the world, or within regions, or within countries? Do you believe that innovation in medicine is going to push out some people from the system, or on the contrary, is it going to allow people to have a greater access to treatment? Laurence, I think that along with Odile, you focus a lot on innovation in other regions of the world. So could you give us your take on this? First of all, I need to remind you that innovation needs to be useful for patients. It needs to give them extra years in good health, because of course if you live longer but with a poorer quality of life, it's not useful at all. I believe that innovation is of course going to help patients, but you need to take into account differences. If you look at North African countries, it's pretty close to the situation in our countries. There's a bit less funding, so the machines are not that technological, or not as technological as what we have, but the care that is provided is more or less what we have in our countries. But then you have to look at screening for breast cancer, for example. It's much less ubiquitous in North African countries. So it's not about technology, it's about programs. However, there are some countries where you don't have any roads. There's not any kind of infrastructure. So if you've got the best PET scan machine in the country. If no one can drive to it, then of course it's not going to work. So yes, technological innovation is important, but it's also about organization, so that you don't have these double standards in medicine and in access to medicine. And sometimes it happens in our countries. For example, I remember that there was a product that was not reimbursed. You mentioned 18 months earlier, but for me, I worked on some products for 10 years before we were granted reimbursement rights. So that really creates a difference, because you have some people who can pay for the medicine and others who can't because it's not reimbursed. So in France, we don't all live longer and better. It depends where you live. Okay, let's now talk about education. Some people say that to deploy technologies on a large scale, you need to focus on the next generation and wait for the previous technology and its users to retire. What is your perspective on future improvements when it comes to educating, training healthcare professionals? Well, that is a huge question, but also a very, very relevant one. In fact, I would also like to talk about the importance of creating and attracting talent. We've been talking a lot about technology, data, AI today, but what is important is to have the right people, the right talents at the right place at the right time, the people who are going to allow you to win the innovation race. And one of the important issues for us as investors is to have the right framework and to make sure that our managerial teams, our boards, have the right people working under them. Earlier, we talked about the United States or Asia, where things are changing quickly. People have understood what is going on. They've made some mistakes, and some of them have been extremely successful. But, you know, these talents, it's difficult to find them. You have to track them down and attract them. So that's the first thing. Secondly, on the longer term, you also have to work on your education, training, upstream, downstream. So there's some European initiatives, for example, biotech Erasmus schemes, their digital campuses, also in France. We have also some clusters. Clusters is about really pooling talents, bringing them together in the same place to build synergies and spark new ideas. So from an education point of view, in all med schools, we need to adapt the curriculum. We need to have specialized courses. At Sophie Nova, for instance, all the associate analysts are people who have PhDs in medicine. So people who have studied medicine for 10, 12 years and who've achieved a PhD. And in some areas, these people are extremely bright. They're already caught in the slipstream of current innovation. So we call upon key opinion leaders, for instance. So yeah, we need to guide that innovation, keep track of it, and if we don't have the talents in our countries, then we need to be able to attract them to our countries and to our companies. And that's really a huge task to undertake for a fund such as our own. Data scientists, scientists, we talked about AI and data. Data scientists are far and few between and often very expensive as a result. I'm going to give you two quick examples. Now I'm going to talk about the United States once again because it's a country where healthcare is really different to anywhere else. So we work with a player that uses our equipment to treat fire-related problems. We don't have deep pockets like our neighbor here on the left or like others. But last week, I received an email from a fellow who told me, look, this professor is using your system to operate on thyroids, and I want to use your system. And I think it's great because it means that teachers in the US who are there to train people on top of what they do in the clinic, they are getting this message across. They are conveying this message, and they are allowing their fellowships to have access to the same kind of technologies that they have. I've never seen that in Europe. That kind of transmission, I've never seen that. Other example, since we're talking about education, I'm sure it might spark some inspiration, but what I've seen is that surgeons, they have their own practice, and it's difficult to change the way in which you work when you get used to your practice. It's not about just using technology to slightly improve what you do. No, you have to sometimes really call into question everything that you've done so far to be able to harness the power of technology. So it's difficult to take on board our technology. People understand why it's good, but you have to use it properly, or to use it to an extent that is sufficient to improve your results. So what we've decided to do is to go into a brand new area for us, and that is cognitive science. So we've got an expert in this area that is going to help us understand how surgeons think, so to speak, so that in the future we can convince surgeons to adopt our technology so that they understand how it works and so that they can see that they get better patient outcomes when they use our technology. So the expert that we called upon is very happy. He's an expert in cognitive science. And at university, when they train people like this, they don't know where to place them afterwards on the labor market. And I believe that we can open up the healthcare sector to cognitive science experts.
Merci Odile. On the healthcare market, Alain, there seems to be some kind of paradox. From the supply perspective, it seems to be globalized with players all around the world. And when it comes to access to markets, given the organization of some markets and reimbursements that is under the national mandate, it seems that it's much more fragmented. So how do you strike the right balance? How can you reconcile this globalized supply and at the same time this fragmented national demand? But I think it's a bit like double standards that we mentioned earlier. There are huge differences between countries. If you go to India and visit a hospital there, I mean, you will really learn a lot. I mean, we're very lucky in France. We've got a vaccine. Most of us are vaccinated. Look at TB, for example. We're still not able to solve the problem because $10 for a test is too expensive for some countries. And the overall picture for healthcare in the world, when you take a step back, is a bit grim. The only solution that we've come up with is to make products that are as generic as possible. If not, it doesn't work from a commercial point of view. But for some countries, it's still too expensive, so we have to wait a little bit longer. And you also need to have a local presence. In China, for example, you have some players that have been there for 30, 35 years. So it's really about plugging into the local healthcare network and system. But there are no
silver bullets. You're caught up with the reality of finances and pricing, really. But you need to work with larger foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or with WHO to come up with large-scale solutions, but they remain in many ways flawed. But yeah, we haven't got any miracles for you, I'm afraid. Thank you. Sorry, does this mic work? Yes, it does. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It was extremely interesting. We're now going to take a couple of questions from the floor. Thank you very much. I have a question that is more focused on funding than on healthcare. A question for Cédric, maybe. At Sophie Nova, you've got a crossover fund. So 2 questions on that fund. That is a great success and a pioneering model for tech funding in Europe, because it exists in the States, but not so much here in Europe. How were you able to be so successful, and how could we maybe bring about similar funds in Europe, in other areas than healthcare? Well, thanks for the interesting curveball or question. A lot of people who don't know who I am here today. I started by working in financial analysis and in private banking. So yeah, then I stepped into the world of investment, and people told me you need to raise funds. And I said, well, look, I've been fundraising for the last 10, 15 years. I know how it works. Let's get on with it. But in fact, first-time team, first-time fund, indeed, it is a little bit of a problem. It's a bit like when you step out of university, you've got your diploma, you're trying to find a job, and people tell you, well, okay, to secure this position, you need 3 years worth of experience. And you say, okay, well, when am I going to start out then? And it's a bit the same thing here, because you've got more than 50% of institutional players who don't take any meetings. And so you have to be quite creative and also resilient and persistent, and you end up getting there. But it was a longer process. It took 18 months, so yeah, it took quite a long time. What is interesting, and that's the second part of the question, is to take a look at the evolutions. Timing is key, as we always say. Maybe we were a bit too early coming into the game. 5, 6 years ago, we were talking about growth, that startups were great, but we needed to scale up and we needed capital to grow the companies. We didn't have any dedicated teams to do that. And I think that people now listen to us a little bit more and understand that it's a very important topic, including in government and at EU level. People understand that it's a bit of a shame to set up companies, put them on the right track, and realize that in fact, as soon as they're successful, they're bought up by someone in China or in the US, because funding dries up in Europe. So we are very interested and very happy to see that there's some European initiatives that help us in our industry, but also in others, and this will allow us to build champions in the future. So no secrets, it's all about being persistent and being brave. Maybe one final question? Do we have a last question in the room before we wrap up? It seems that there are no more questions. Okay, well, thank you very much. We have to go to the plenary, so we're going to wrap up. Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting to listen to you. Thank you to our speakers.